To reassemble the linear actuator, which is more commonly called the cylinder or ram, begin by assembling the nose nut. Inspect, lubricate, and install the O-rings and seals into the grooves inside the nose nut, starting with the innermost and working your way out. When installing the scraper and seals, make sure that the smaller diameter is facing outward. To install the seals and the scraper, bend each one inward at one point so it forms a kidney shape, reducing its diameter. It can now be inserted into the groove in the housing. Then press the bent point into the groove. When both seals and the scraper have been installed, lubricate and insert the appropriate sizing tool to restore them to their original shape. Allow the sizing tool to stay in place for a few minutes while the seals are reshaped. Also, clean, lubricate, and install the O-ring around the outside of the nose nut as well. After removing the sizing tool, install each bearing. Overlap the ends so the diameter is reduced, and then place it into its groove inside the nose nut so that it sits on the landing. With the seals and bearings reinstalled, the nose nut is ready to be installed on the actuator rod. Remove any residual thread lock that may still be on the threads for the rod, piston, and rod end. Then slide the nose nut over the actuator rod. Apply Loctite 271 or equivalent thread locker to the threads on both the rod end and the piston. Then install both the rod end and the piston on the actuator rod, making sure that the top of the nose nut is facing the rod end. Hand tighten both ends and then secure the assembly in a vise, holding it by the rod end. With the piston end up, insert a 1/2-inch socket drive into the cutout on the piston and fully tighten the assembly. Then torque it to 75 foot-pounds or 101.7 Newton-meters. On the piston, inspect, lubricate, and install the square ring. To install the seal, use a special sizing tool to stretch the seal so that it can be lowered onto the piston. Settle the seal into its groove. Then lubricate the inside of the appropriate resizing tool and insert the piston to restore the seal to its original shape. Once the seal is settled into its proper size, clean, lubricate, and install the quad ring into the groove of the seal. Be sure it seats flat and isn't twisted when reinstalled. Then install both bearings into their grooves on the piston. Now secure the actuator housing vertically into a vise, holding it by the fixed rod end, with the open end facing up. Insert the actuator rod assembly into the housing with the piston end down. Once the rod has been inserted about halfway into the housing, push the nose nut down the rod and thread it into the housing. Then push the rod down fully into the actuator housing. A special socket is used that will slide over the rod end and grab the nose nut. Tighten the nose nut and then torque it to 240 foot-pounds or 325.4 Newton-meters. The actuator shear pin assembly should be completely disassembled and cleaned of any residual Loctite and free of any oil in preparation of reinstalling the actuator. The components in the shear pin work as a system, so all parts must function together so the shear pin does not fail prematurely. The system works by stretching the bolts and causing them to fail in tension in an overload situation. It is critical that the tapered sections of the end pieces and the center shaft are not deformed and that special high-strength bolts are used. The shear pin should never be reused after it has failed. The entire system should be replaced. The fully assembled linear actuator can now be reattached to the manipulator. First, remove the caps from the hydraulic fittings on the actuator. Then, fully extend the actuator rod out of the housing. Slide the shoulder actuator rod protector over the actuator with the hydraulic fittings positioned through the slot in the protector. Apply Loctite 271 or equivalent thread locker to one of the socket head bolts and thread it through one of the end pieces and into the center shaft. Line it up with the holes in the clevis on the azimuth. Insert the partially assembled clevis shear pin through the holes and through the rod end. Apply Loctite to the other socket head bolt and thread it through the second end piece and into the center shaft. Use 2 1/4-inch Allen sockets to tighten the screws and torque them to 30 foot-pounds or 40.7 Newton-meters. Now, remove the caps in the hydraulic hoses. Rotate the actuator up and thread the hoses onto the fittings on the actuator. Be sure that as you face the underside of the arm, that the shoulder hose to the left is connected to the fitting at the rod end and the longer hose to the right is connected to the fitting that is further down the actuator towards the azimuth. Tighten them using a 9/16 wrench. Now reinstall the shoulder actuator pivot pin through the fixed rod end and place the spacer over the pin. Rotate the actuator up until the pivot pin lines up with the holes in the upper arm. Apply anti-seize to the threads of the pivot pin bolts and thread them into the ends of the pivot pin. Use an 1 1/8" socket to tighten the pivot pin bolts. The pivot pin will rotate while the bolts are turned, so use an 1 1/4" wrench to hold the flat section of the pin while the bolts are tightened. Torque them each to 240 foot-pounds or 325.4 Newton meters. Lastly, install new tie wraps to secure the shoulder actuator rod protector to the azimuth clevis shear pin. To test the actuator, turn the manipulator on and slowly raise it up. There will be air in the system that might make the manipulator drop or move erratically, so make sure control is re-established before removing the support. Once the support is removed, fully actuate the arm several times to bleed any air out of the system. Look for any leaks and correctly tighten the fittings if necessary. The linear actuator has now been fully reassembled and installed.